this rainy afternoon. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'll also, my name's Steve. I'll also echo the thanks for those that made it through. Boy, it was raining like crazy about half an hour ago. So thank you for making it. And it looks like it's stopped now. What I'm going to do is start the session today in the way that we always like to, which is a little bit of a memory moment. So we're going to ask somebody to take a picture for us. So if you don't want to have your face in a picture, then look away, look down. If you're cool with just having your face in the picture, then smile for the camera. But we always like to be able to capture this. So if I can have one of my teammates jump up on stage, and our three panelists will stand here, and if everybody can just stand up, and we're going to do pick, right? So what I'm going to do is, without a lot of pomp and ceremony, I'm going to ask David, Zekin, and Richard, our three panelists, to jump up. They're going to do a more official and elegant introduction of themselves. I'm going to sit here, so we'll do that. So I'm going to set expectations at the beginning, which is we have some things that we'd like to discuss. Importantly, I'm going to ask for questions from you, because this is really your opportunity to engage with leaders that you might not otherwise have a chance to ask questions of directly. So please, the purpose of these events is for us to learn, discuss, debate, disagree, agree, doesn't matter. It's just part of the journey. So please don't leave me to be the one that has to continuously think of something interesting to ask. I have some ideas, but I think it's more important for you to have things that are important to either the business you're building or investment decisions you're making, or you're just intellectually interested. So with that in mind, we're going to get started. And what I'm going to do is go from my left on down and ask each of the leaders to take a moment to introduce themselves, because leaders always introduce themselves in a better way than some moderator reading a list. So Richard, over to you.
All right. So thank you, Steve. And first of all, thanks to SG Innovate for having me. Richard, name is Richard Koh, so I'm the CTO here at Microsoft Singapore. Let me see a little bit about myself. If you know the product Office 365, yes, I was part of the team that built it 12 years ago. So I started my career in Microsoft in Redmond, and moved out here about 7 years ago. So, well, I'm Singaporean, actually moved back here 7 years ago, and been working with the Singapore subsidiary in the past 2.5 years, working on all aspects related to Microsoft technology and how we represent it to the wider ecosystem here. And most recently, just running the AI country plan. Talk a little bit about that throughout the panel itself, but really happy to be here. So really hope to engage with all of you guys. Thank you.
Okay, Zekin.
Hi, I'm Zekin. I'm the Deputy Commissioner in the Personal Data Protection Commission. I also wear a hat in the Infocomm Media Development Authority, where I head up a group that combines both data innovation as well as data protection. Lawyer by training, and how did I end up with this job? Well, actually, I don't know. No. I was one of those that actually have been working with data and IT systems quite unconsciously for a long, long time. CIO of the Supreme Court before I came over here. So actually had to build IT systems, had to manage data that was collected through an e-filing system, had to make sure that we were taking care of the data properly, work with data issues and all that. And I guess that kind of like gave me the grounds and hands-on experience when you talk about information management, data lifecycle management. And then when I started this job as a Data Protection Commission, I realized that actually, you know, good data protection is actually 80% good information lifecycle management. And that's the word that I've been going around spreading. You got good data protection, good information lifecycle management, you got good data protection. And quite coincidentally and quite unexpectedly, about 18 months ago, within IMDA, I was asked to take a look at, you know, since you're looking at data, do a bit more than just regulate and say you can't do things with data, right? What can you do with data, right? So that kind of gave me a different perspective, and started looking at what are the technologies that make use of data? And what are the benefits that make use of data? One thing led to another, and now I find myself involved in a lot of discussions about data-driven technologies. AI, machine learning is the hot topic for the last 12 months. So that's an area that we've been talking about. I'd be happy to share a bit more about the work that we've been doing in this area.
Okay, thanks. David.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. My name is David, and actually not too dissimilar from Ziki, and I'm not quite sure how I got this job. But from a background perspective, at least I had one degree of monotonity. It's, I've always like to say I've always been a geek. So actually started off with AI back when I was 16 when I picked up a book about Prolog and kind of stuck with it all the way through. So kind of been doing it in the areas of, from a research perspective, genomics, aerodynamics, neuroscience, and kind of really fell in love. And I know it sounds really weird coming from kind of saying data. I can just feel, stop talking, you geek, but absolutely fell in love with data and the possibilities that come with it. And kind of gone beyond to seeing how can people use it, how can people actually, organizations leverage in it, and not just in terms of tapping away and building systems, but really about culture. How to bring the human aspect of it. And I get a lot of slack about this one. So if you ever end up on my LinkedIn page, I don't call myself a data scientist, which, by the way, I think I've had every single title along the way. So when I first came to Singapore, what was it? Business Insight, that then became business analytics, that was then advanced analytics, and then data science. And then someone came to me not too long ago, actually a year and a half ago, 2 years, and said to me, David, have you heard about this thing called machine learning? I was like, oh, I happen to have actually heard about it. So I've had every single title. But if you ever happen to end up on my LinkedIn page, I call myself a data artist. And I know I'm not trying to be pretentious or all that, but the reason why I'm saying that is two. One, have you ever met a scientist that doesn't use data? So that's kind of the tongue-in-cheek element. And the other one is to really emphasize that it's not just about the science components, it's about people. And it's about not just people in terms of who are building it, it's people who are using it and people who are impacted by it, which kind of also is aligned with this underlying topic. So with that, I'll stop.
All right, and each time that your title evolved, your value continued to increase as well, right?
So this is when I say, thank you, marketeers. Please don't stop.
Just like if you add .ai at the end of any startup, you're automatically going to have a higher valuation. Let's talk about data a little bit, because if we're here to talk about AI ethics, it's a big topic. What does ethics mean? How do we want to approach it? But let's start a little bit with this idea of data, since we just all self-introduced. There are some schools of thought. We had Li Kai-fu with us here, who was talking about data and why China is in a leadership position because of more data. So if we start with the assumption more data leads to more, or better, if I can say, AI, do you generally agree that more data is good? Or can I also argue the opposite, which is less data, but perhaps better quality data, better annotated data in the case of images? Let's just talk about more data, less data. Anybody want to jump in?
Oh, see, I knew I was digging myself a hole there. Is this on? It's on. It's on. Okay. Okay, I would, of course, have that kind of polar view. I'm self-conflicted, and that's another element of being a data scientist. But actually, I would go by the point of view of saying that actually more data is good. And I was actually just sharing earlier that I used to be part of this, I was part of many, but part of a European EU Commission project, which was about something to do with the image annotation, and we were commissioned to build this novel, uber scientific and uber smart algorithm to basically detect certain stuff, yada, yada, yada. So I remember we were presenting to them, and basically the guy threw at us one hell of a span and said, with this wonderful algorithm you've built, you just simply throw more data, a lot more data, I should emphasize that, and you use basically a very simple classifier, and it was able to do a lot better than the very sophisticated one. So it kind of really shown that the volume of the data was able, despite the noise, despite the issues, despite everything, to able to extract the capacity of it. So fundamentally, yes, I would argue that more data is better. Okay, anybody want to take a contrary position?
Actually, I was going to point out that what you're talking about is not more data alone, but there was more variety in the data. There were more things in there for the ML to identify and look for patterns, right? So because you could have a lot of data, but it's all the same thing. Then at some points, you will hit a plateau. So my own view is, what's the kind of data that you're going to get? And when we have a smaller data set, can we compensate? Can we compensate by doing more with the data, better quality data? And that's one of the real experience that we've had. We've worked, I've done a lot of work in the legal sector, working with legal information, and I've got two projects that we've done before. Compared to other countries and other consumer bases, we don't have that much data compared to them. But what we did was, well, in one project, which is a legal research project, we had a very disciplined taxonomy that we put in place in 2003, right? But why did we put that in place? Because it was just good information management, it was good library science, it was good knowledge management. We did the taxonomy, we had good discipline, and when they had to start looking through that, they were able to achieve more with a smaller data set. Same thing as well with another project that, that the judiciary went through recently, trying to use AI to extract. Again, they did more with the data because associated with the information was a semi-structured database. They could do more. So I would say 2 points, right? Variety is important, not just volume, and you can compensate with a bit of good old-fashioned discipline.
I have to jump in there. I mean, outside the analogy of big data sets, small data set, and overcompensating, but it's the point of the thing that you're mentioning about having the due diligence and the framework and effectively the taxonomy. But then if you'd have all of those and more data.
Okay, so let me try and understand here, because here's where this path is leading. If Singapore does not, or in other countries, do not have the same volume of data, for whatever reason, will they, and in our case, will we, not be builders of great AI tools, but instead need to adopt tools built by others because they have better data and because through reinforcement and deep learning they can continue to improve where the outcomes are? So I'm really trying to understand less about the quantity of data per se, and does it mean that we are hamstrung in any way, or can Singapore be just as good a builder of AI tools as anybody that has 200 or 2,000 or 2 million times the data?
Okay, I'll just jump in on that. So, okay, on the first point, I actually agree that Singapore, we can be as good a builders. However, putting that aside from a conceptual point of view and a possibility perspective, just look at the reality. The toolkits that you already are using from Microsoft, from Google, from Facebook, from Amazon, these are all modules that have been built not here or globally on larger volumes of data and then been provisioned. So while it is possible, and I firmly believe it's possible, very much to these points that was mentioned, the underlying trend is that there is a shift in dominance.
So, no, those are great points. It's very hard to disagree with you guys for what you said. With 2 irregularities in the room. Now, the thing is you guys are right, and I think just take that examples of what Microsoft is doing. For example, let me take this in a slightly different space. In the cybersecurity world, we run one of the largest network in the world, and the amount of, let's say, emails and processes and all of that's running through, let's say, tools like Office 365, you know, detecting malware and stuff like that. It's hard because we have to process like 6.5 trillion signals every month. So volume actually helps a lot. But at the same time, I think the amount of work that we put in to look at false positives, things like that, and then making sure that we can train the algorithm so that we are protecting our customers and that the right malware is detected such that it doesn't impede productivity, then it serves the greater good itself. So I think it's not just the tools part of it, it's more like the algorithms part of it, where the data sets are really important. I think that's where, yes, in some ways, we're a little bit hamstrung here because of the kind of data sets that we have. But if you think about like what David has said, the tools that a lot of the companies are building, it's based off on very, very large data sets. So those are the kind of advantages that it comes with tools from us.
So let me rotate the conversation for a minute, and then I'm going to go to you and see if you have questions. The topic here is around AI ethics, right? David, we were chatting a little bit before whether it's a word game or it's a true differentiation, and you wanted me to save it until you had the chance to do the big reveal to the audience. Is there ethical AI? Are there ethics in AI? And then I know there's, of course, an AI council and so on that's been set up to try and tackle this issue of ethics. But AI ethics, ethical AI?
Okay, so again, personal viewpoint, I don't think they're the same thing. I don't think they're the same thing because AI ethics really goes down to the components of how you go about again, to me, from our interpretation point of view, in terms of leveraging your data, providing privacy, building the models, making sure there's some degrees of debiasness and so forth. So it's really, I see it to me as the building blocks and the components that you will go about in building an AI. That's AI ethics. Whereas an ethical AI, and I know this is a bit of a semantical thing, it's the outcome that it's an AI which is ethical. So the first one, AI ethics, I strongly believe we can, we should, and we must achieve. I don't yet believe it is possible to have an ethical AI.
So that begs a question, obviously, but before we go there, Ziken, when we think about how AI will be used, one of the classic problems that's always presented is in the context of a driverless vehicle, the classic trolley problem. How do we think about AI in terms of ethics? And I'm going to expose my own bias, which is I don't know how humans are expected to make what would be considered the best choice, if there is such a thing, in a lose-lose situation. But when you think about AI ethics, or twisting it, ethical AI, how do you, as the person that has to really think about use cases for data, think about this idea of ethics? How does PDPC contemplate ethics in the use cases that you either approve or don't approve?
Well, the approach that we've taken, and without planning, I will have to say that we've distributed a model, a document for everyone, right? The approach that we've taken really is essentially this. We don't want to wade into the debate of what are the ethical values, right? We don't believe that there's any benefit for us wading into that debate and adding to the list. Go Google it, you're going to find lists from different countries, different institutions, different sectors. But what we do believe is that and a lot of the work we do is really to promote the adoption of AI by organizations and companies into their work processes and products, to promote confidence that consumers have in using these products and services. So what we do promote is, please articulate a set of commercial objectives, a set of corporate values that you want to adhere to and you want to make as a statement to your organization, to your customers. And what we try to do is, with a model framework, help companies translate that into stuff that can be done in the office. How do you integrate this intention into your corporate values? How do you translate that into your internal governance framework? How do you translate that into risk assessments? How do you translate risk assessment into decision-making models? How do you infuse that into the way you're managing data, in the way that you're training models and selecting models and testing them? That's the focus of where we are at. So coming back to the trolley problem, with that as a long-winded background, my usual answer, because I've been asked this quite often, is this. There's a spectrum of views, right? On the one hand, it has been said, well, when we take our driver's license, we were never asked that question. I know I was never asked that question when I sat and passed my driver's license. I was never asked that question. So why do you expect AI to do that, right? On the other extreme, right, I will point out the fact that, end of the day, your driverless car is a system that's designed by someone. The AI engine does things that you, by design decision, permit it to do, right? So put in context, I would say that there's a certain responsibility for companies that are deploying driverless cars to be aware and be prepared for well-known scenarios. And if those are well-known scenarios, and if you assess that these are high risk, why leave the chance to AI models making decisions based on data sets? Why? Design it the old-fashioned way. Try to design it such that you have better control. You narrow the window for this risk to occur, but you are identifying the risk, you're managing the risk, and you're doing something about it. And when bad things happen, ultimately, we are looking really at the question of how much work was done to prevent an accident. So if you, so basically, one cop-out answer is really, well, if you know that you'll be driving, the driverless car is going to drive through a school zone, right? Well, design it to slow down such that you don't have a question about whether you can stop in time, have to pick one or the other. You will be able to stop in time, right? And you will cause lighter damage, lighter injury. So those are the kind of things, the sophistication that we want to bring to the conversation. And that's a long-winded lawyer's way of not giving an answer.
Okay, so without pressing you further, are there questions that anybody in the audience would like to ask of any of the panelists before I go on to something else on my mind? Yes, please.
Very interesting. I admire the enthusiasm of the data scientist, and I appreciate the complexities of what you're trying to do, especially in Microsoft and also with the law. One of the concerns I have with respect to this notion of ethics and trying to think that we can make an ethical AI is the challenge related to bias. You have a bias in the way in which you develop your algorithm. That bias is if I understand correctly, in large measure a result of the cultural influences that you have as you develop. And all of the programmers that are moving forward in the development of the AI also have their biases. And I'm wondering, I'm in Elon Musk's camp, by the way. I'm very afraid of what's happening with AI because we don't know how to properly regulate what's going on when we try and deal with the bias. I'd be interested in some of your thoughts on that. And the other thing that, when we say that we have limited data, okay, I'm involved with a project where I am working with Watson, IBM Watson, to develop a medical school tutor. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm involved in that is because I think that that is the only way we're going to be able to move forward in kind of having a symbiotic relationship with AI, in that the young children that we are nurturing right at the moment are going to have some kind of way of interfacing, but we're limited by digits, and we're limited by the fact that we can't think, integrate as fast as, say, the AI. How are you going to deal with that? The data point, I don't think that Singapore suffers from a data point problem. It's how we're going to manage what AI is going to do in hollowing out our middle class.
Okay, so there's a couple of different things there. Let me set aside for the moment the issue about employment and social disintermediation and so on. Let's come back a little bit to the initial question about bias. Anybody jump in that feels compelled?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great question. It's so hard to say that you have something that's not biased at all. That's probably not true. But I think one of the things is that it's let's say for organizations like ourselves, it's really the amount of effort that we put in to first of all educate not just the programmers, but a lot of the people that surrounds the technologies as well. So if you think about that, what we had done internally within the company was we look at, back to David's point around the difference between ethical AI and AI ethics itself. We started down the path on AI ethics. You guys remember that whole incident around that Twitter bot that Microsoft released called Microsoft Tay? Yeah, okay. So everybody knows that, the Twitter bot that ran races in a day. So that was a huge, huge learning lesson for us, that the reliability and the safety, the privacy and security, all of the different aspects of the technology itself must be considered a lot more seriously, and also well informed by people surrounding the technologies who are building and deploying those services, for example. So whether is it around inclusiveness or fairness, the diversity of the teams that comes together to deploy or build those algorithms is crucial. So in a very big way, what we've done within the company was to make sure, I mean, there's no 100%, but really ensure that there is a fair amount of diversity in the teams who are coming to build those tools, as well as the data sets that feeds those tools, and also deploy it. And have the kind of committees or the working groups that ask the tough questions around those aspects of the design itself. Then when you start to go out there, then you can say, okay, we are gaining more confidence with that. So we took the lessons from Microsoft Tay, and then now we have Xiao Eyes in China, who's like interacting with, I think, close to 600 million people. Rena in Japan, Zoe in the US. So some of those lessons are kind of manifesting itself pretty well. And that was some of those efforts that we try to do. Those principles around, fairness, inclusiveness, transparency, accountability, the human in the center, all of that. And for the ethical AI outcome part of it, yes, we're not there yet. But what we've also done is that we're running committees to look at how our customers and partners are also using our technology. We're asking questions as well. Are there going to be denial of critical services, for example? Is the technology really there to be able to do that job? And those are the kind of hard questions that we have to ask ourselves before we think about using those technology in those kind of scenarios as well. So it's a journey in some ways, but those are the kind of questions and those are the kind of conversations and engagements that we need to have for us to progress.
Can I take a stab? Because, and perhaps not even giving an answer, but I want to take the couple of points that we're talking about: regulation, ethical AI, and also given an opportunity, a bit of color why I said that I don't think it is at least yet possible to have an ethical AI, as well as that point about discrimination, and try to unpack that a bit. If you, first of all, need to start with the point of view that we are trying to approach and solve a problem that hasn't been solved for humans. What I mean by that is when we go out and saying we cannot discriminate, well, think about it. We all discriminate. And then take one more step before that. If I now take away every person's ability to discriminate in this room, can you make a decision? You will not be able to. Because the ability to have a degree of bias or discrimination is in fact our ability to make a decision, a weightage in one form or another. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, so that brings us to the point by realizing, okay, there is actually some degree of good bias and good discrimination, or call it preferential treatment of one form or another, and there's that element that we can agree that's not good effectively. So that distinction is actually extremely important. Now, drawing that line between what's good and bad is extremely difficult because it's a societal point of view. And that kind of brings me to the second point. If you take that question of the trolley point, this is wonderful paper. I can never remember the names of people, but it's a recent publication in Nature. We're talking about a month ago. It'll come to me in a minute. And what they did, didn't ask machines, how would you choose between, I think it was an old person or a young person. And they went and asked 40 million people around the world. What would you choose if you had to choose between running over an old person or running over a young person? Guess what the answers came back? They could be clustered into 3 segments. One segment which, and again, I have no discrimination bias, I'm just kind of verbatim trying to remove from the reports. the Asian cultures would actually kill the younger person. Sorry, it was the younger person. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, ethical or unethical, but given the position of a choice, that's what they chose. When they went to the Americans, it was the exact opposite. So that now gives you a different dimension, that ethics is cultural. It's contextual. Now that brings me to the third element of what I meant by regulation. It now makes us realize that you don't have an ethical AI because humans make a two-step decision in one go. I make a decision, and then I decide whether my decision is ethical or not within the context of the culture that I'm in. An AI can easily make a decision. It can make a decision based on the logistics, based on the information, based on the statistics. It's not at that position yet to say, is it ethical or not, because of this diversity of cultures that we face in. But the ability of breaking this down into the components then allows regulators to go, okay, what should we be looking at? How should we be looking at it? What we should be breaking apart, and what should we believe to the politicians to tell us whether it's right or wrong, effectively? So I know it's a bit of a, not exactly answering, but this I call it peeling the onion because there's so many layers and you cry with every single one of them. But it's important to, if you ever are going to get to that stage when we can say it is an ethical AI, or so-called as such as one.
Yeah, so the way we are looking at it and we are approaching it is, again, we avoid trying to make that judgment about what is the ethical value, right? So what we promote is understand the data, right? What we want people to do is, if there's bias in the data, if there's hidden bias in the data, try and discover it and try to make sure whether you can address it. And if you decide not to address it, it's a conscious choice. We split the data from the decision making because you can have different types of decision making models that's augmented or supported by AI, right? The decision, what we aim for in the decision is you don't have unintentional discriminatory decision. If you make an intentional decision to discriminate, well, as a company, as an organization, right, be prepared to stand by it and defend it if your customers are unhappy with you or if you get brought before a court of law. It is the unintentional one. You didn't realize it was there. How do we minimize that risk? How do we do more to address that? So that's how we believe we could try and tackle some of these problems, which leads me to the second, the question I think you were asking, which is a lot of these developments are actually done by people from different cultures from us. It could be, they could be importing different types of cultural bias into it. Well, if you went through a proper discipline of isolating data, testing the models properly, making sure, and you are being disciplined in trying to root out as many of the unintended discriminatory decisions as the result of using the AI model as possible, you are in better control to explain why a certain decision was made after you introduce AI into your work process or into your product or your service.
All right, I've got some questions, so let me try and make sure that we take advantage of the input from the audience. And since we have two regs on the board, on the panel. So how do we harmonize governance frameworks? Because in the same way that MAS seeks to do things with FCA and others, is there something that's already underway, and is it possible to do, given culturally different outcomes, to harmonize governance frameworks when we think about uses of data and compatibility under this larger umbrella of ethics? I guess, can we come to some shared understanding of ethics and the implications for the use of data, and how does that express itself in some harmonized frameworks?
So let me actually first by saying, whoever asked that question, thank you for using the word harmonize. I get very edgy when I hear the word standardize. And standardize means something very, very different because it means everything's the same. So harmonize already takes into context the fact that there's differences. So I absolutely believe it's possible, and in fact there's already, actually quite globally, you're finding more and more regulators, specifically within the financial hemisphere, which are lifting up their heads saying, as regulators, we need to start thinking about this. And the approach that we have taken locally And we're now kind of both promoting it and seeing it being adopted internationally. In fact, the greatest one that I had is I got invited to speak on an ethical panel in Canada. And they used the draft of our principles. And I was like, oh, wow, that's a very nice little surprise there. But that's the key word, actually. It's principles. Non-prescriptive principles that we can agree upon. And therefore harmonize the principles that we can say that in terms of what does the ethical standards mean? What does it mean in terms of the discrimination aspects? And for example, I don't think if you haven't read it, please, I encourage, please do read it. I'm very happy to get feedback as well. So about discrimination, we kind of landed on a point by saying, first of all, if it's unjustified, systematic discrimination. And the two key words there is systematic and unjustified. But you see, then what is justified and what is not justified can be contextualized to the culture, can be contextualized to the sector, can be contextualized to who you are, but we can all agree that we should not have an unjustified systematic discrimination. For example, you can have systematic discrimination that is justified, such as if you don't earn a certain amount of money, you're not going to private bank account. I mean, we kind of all live with that. If you're not above a certain age, you're not going to get a policy, premium insurance or something like that. Or if generally you're not a woman, you're not going to get a pregnancy insurance. I mean, these are things that are justifiable and are discriminating. But you have a lot of ones which are unjustifiable. So these are the way that we're seeing that more and more regulators are coming to terms with it to achieve that harmonization.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say that don't worry, things are already happening, right? I could share two things. I mean, David and I, we work very closely together, right? If you take a look at feeds, take a look at the framework that we have, you see common features.
Harmonized.
Right? You see harmonization. Because you know why? Because we work together on it, right? And what the approach that we've taken is, while the PDPC tries to put out a very general framework across for all sectors to take reference from, you will need sector adaptation that can be a lot more contextual and specific. And what David's just saying is that after that has been done, there can continue to be harmonization in the financial sector around the world. Just as what we have been doing is to take what we have done as a framework to go overseas as well and talk to other regulators, and there are international organizations talking to us to try and see whether we could start talking about a harmonized framework on adapting accountability-based framework within an organization. So I think there will be, but what I think we may not ever achieve is like one harmonized standard for all, but you are probably going to see a lot of common features, a lot of common approaches. The whole point is what drives us is really to ensure that there is no confusion in the business world, because the tool suppliers, the service providers, the business users, they're all around about the same group, right? So we don't want to have confusion.
Yeah. So I'd just like to jump in here, and it's not that I'm trying to suck up to you guys, but
that's okay.
I think
that's
here,
okay. Go ahead.
Here in Singapore, I think, in my role, I do have a lot of engagement with my counterparts across the world itself, and I think here in Singapore, the regulators are doing a good job in engaging together with the industry as well, and I think that's a very good thing, because the challenge is that the technology today is coming out a lot from the technology companies like ourselves, for example. And a lot of times we have a responsibility to share that evolution of the technology itself and also engage in the kind of discussions on the evolution itself, the capabilities of what it can do and what it should do. And I think here, with Ziki and with David, there's been a lot of engagements, whether it's panels, working sessions, things like that, to really go into deep conversations around some of these implications itself. So I think the developments of these harmonizations of the principles itself has been, I can safely say here in Singapore is probably one of the leading countries in the world that has a very good set of well-developed, thought-through principles in this space. So kudos to this little island here.
All right, point noted that Microsoft is very appreciative of the work that you're...
It's true, come from the heart.
So let me jump on to a question that I also am intellectually interested in. phrased, seems unethical not to adopt AI when we can see that there are reasonably demonstrable improvements between current and future. And one use case that's well quoted would be driverless vehicles. Clearly, humans drive into each other far too often. In the right system, and I think there's lots of caveats, in the right system setup, then that would be less likely, but yet we don't deploy. AI in health, we're, as SG Innovate, working with some computer vision in health. Clearly, it's in some cases at or above the accuracy rate of radiologists. Not an insult, it's just a sheer volume and throughput. In fact, radiologists are some of the co-founders, but yet adopting and using. So when we talk about ethics, how do we argue the positive, which is it unethical not to use AI, as opposed to, is it ethical to use AI?
Oh, okay, I'm eager to jump in.
You can hardly wait there, man.
I'm like, yes! Absolutely, and I will go the whole, I'll go the full Monty. It is unethical in my viewpoint. And in fact, again, taking a sectoral perspective within the financial sector, I go around and I badger quite a number of compliance officers, risk officers, and you name them, to tell them, why aren't you using AI in your AML? Why aren't you using AI in your trade finance? And it's, to me, I make it very clear, and if anyone here, I make it clear again, using a regulator as the excuse for not doing it is exactly that. It's an excuse. Because the reality is you're not going to switch off your entire systems overnight. No, you'll be running tests, you'll be doing validations. So just saying I'm not going to do anything because you said I can't do it doesn't make any sense, especially when there's demonstrable value that can come out of it. Because at the end of the day, the whole premise of doing things from a regulatory perspective is assuring the stability, assuring that bad things don't happen. Let me give you a little secret. We don't know everything.
Okay, I've got to press. We humans, we
No.
MAS. So
Well, actually, we can go existential, but humans as well, but MAS as well. So it's part of the process of the learning. It's part of the process of understanding on how it can make sense. It doesn't mean that suddenly overnight everything's going to change, but if it is indeed demonstrable, that it doesn't result in further instability, it doesn't result in other subsequent issues that we can't handle with, absolutely, absolutely, and this is why we are encouraging that.
okay, I've got to press. Otherwise, it would be unethical of me not to, which is the consequences of AML, KYC, so anti-money laundering, know your customer, right? The consequences of that going wrong and therefore advocating for the use of AI makes sense, meaning the consequences for going wrong are less or different than if we said AI in driverless vehicles or AI in diagnosis of medical conditions that lead to surgery. So let's continue to press. You're supportive. Do we continue to say, if we can see a path that it's better in use case X, let's go for it? Is that the more ethical response than we have unknown unknowns and therefore we're not ready to deploy?
But isn't that the current, so let's take healthcare. Isn't that the current case? Put aside AI, put aside technology. When you're faced with a situation and you know there's a risk, but that risk has demonstrated that can do better than this other one, and you haven't taken that chance and potentially saved that life. That's exactly the point by saying you haven't taken the chance to save that person's life.
Well, we'll all agree, and I think this is an interesting part of society's embracing. My argument is autonomous vehicles are not generally a technology-limited deployment. It's primarily society, which is, am I willing to get in a car that is driverless? How do I think about insurances? How do I think about liability? How do I think about the other person? Because the tech isn't perfect, but neither was the automobile when people started cruising around. That's where seatbelts and airbags and anti-lock brakes and all kinds of things over the 90 or 100 years. But we try and perfect some of these things before deploying. So the argument would be, when we look at AI, and we know that in this case it will give a superior outcome. If we remove the use case, but we say agnostically, this will give a superior use case, we have reasonable evidence to believe it to be true, must we then ethically use?
I will chime in on that. I will share conversations that we've had, not in AI. Yeah. not in AI, but in technology. And well, actually, it had an AI element. You see, about 10 years ago, we started this thing about, I came from the courts 10 years ago, right? So we have litigation, you got this process called discovery where you're supposed to go through a lot of documents, right? The lawyer is supposed to help you go through a lot of documents, look for what's relevant, what's not. And you know today, right? Every email is copied to 20 other people who then reply to the next 40 and is copied again. So you have got lots of documents and you needed technology. So we put out a practice direction, we started promoting the use of technology. And in the second oldest profession in the world, we thought that, you know, it's technology, you know, we shouldn't run into it. But a group of lawyers actually turned it around and said, wait a minute, we owe a professional duty to our clients, right? To perfect our craft. And if there's technology available and we don't advise them of the benefits, or we don't know enough, or we don't take it upon ourselves to know enough so that we can advise them of the benefits and use it to their advantage, we would have fallen below our professional duty of care, right? So that was that. Now, if you, and I said there was an AI element because although 10 years ago we were looking at keyword searches, a few years after that we talked about predictive coding, which was actually a very early example of supervised learning, right? Now, in that context, a lot of us work in companies, right? Guess who has that similar duty? Directors owe that duties to shareholders. You have a similar duty, shareholder value, right? So if there is a benefit to be pursued, to be considered, right? I would put forward the points and throw it open and ask, do you owe a duty to your shareholders to at least consider, right? Weigh the arguments, make the assessment, and come up with a proper recommendation, right? Whether you should be deploying AI into your organization, whether it is for efficiency or whether it is for enhancing your product or your service.
Well, since regulation tends to be driven by consumer demand, so you take a look at Uber. If Uber is not somewhere, then people agitate. If Airbnb is not somewhere, people agitate. So to some extent, regs are a function of how much people want. So let me just do a straw poll. I have no idea how it will turn out, so I'm just curious, which is, if there was some reasonable evidence that an AI system would be a better decision, whether it's controlling your vehicle, advising your doctor on whether you should or should not have a treatment. So let's not argue about the data or anything. If we could say it's reasonably true that AI would be a better choice, would you, as people, be willing to accept that? Or is the idea, no, you know, who knows what this crazy thing is and what it's designed to do? So I'm curious, if you jumped in an AV and it said turn left, not right, are you willing to put that into the hands of an artificially intelligent system? For those that would say yes, just raise your hand, and for those that wouldn't?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I add something that can I?
This is selection bias.
Wait a second. Now we're
Selection bias. The population is.
No, but can I add something to that?
saying because people are a technology-oriented event, everybody's like, yes, go for it quickly.
Came here.
Actually, on both your examples, if I know you said agnostic, but how many of you use a GPS to get from point A to point B? Then you already have been using AI.
And how many
of you, when have a
frustrated?
cold, you Google? Or when you're feeling bad, so that the reality.
Come on. I mean, yeah, I agree. AI is everywhere, and it always will be everywhere. So I mean, we can kind of go that way. What I'd like to do is this idea of consequence. So you know, predictive filling in of search. You know, I agree. Alexa, cool. But this idea of if you go to the doc and the doc says, I'm not very sure, let me ask the machine in the corner, and I'm making it an example just for illustration. I'm not talking about Watson or anything else. I'm just saying, let me go, because it's clearly the case that there will be more medical research, more use cases, more images available to a system than any individual doctor can consume. So now the question is, am I willing to trust that, or do I still want the doctor to give the yes, no? At what point in time does it go straight to the system? Because I had that debate this morning with the founder of a computer vision and health company that's saying, I still have to get all the radiologists to sign off, but hopefully someday we'll straight line from decision to implementation. So would you be willing to go for that binary, yes, I'll trust the system implicitly? Not asking for a show of hand, but that's where the consequence, which is I will undergo that surgical procedure because the system said it was the right choice.
So I know there wasn't a question per se, but I still want to answer it because I find it fascinating. In fact, despite everything I said, I believe that you must always deliberately keep the human. Always.
And as a line of defense, or as the social wrapper on the AI?
It's a combination of them. One, it's a social wrapper. Second is we don't want to end up in a world where basically we're completely just invalidated. We have nothing to do.
Ooh,
we just
this comes into this whole, that's the other part of your question, which is the useless class.
Which actually goes to the... Because let me give you two aspects. So how long has autopilot in planes exist? Yet the pilot, human, still takes off and lands. You know that an autopilot can take off and land far better than any human. Yet you will still put your faith in a human to take off and land.
No. Let me give you a real life, sorry, I didn't mean to make this about David and me, but here's the real life example. I was flying into Luxembourg 2 weeks ago. We're coming out of London, flying into Luxembourg. And it's something, and I've flown a lot over the years, and stewardesses came through and said, everybody please turn off all your electronic devices. Pilot has asked us to prepare for auto land situation, right? I'm like, what the heck is auto land? I've been flying a long time. And the pilot comes on and he says, the weather conditions have deteriorated to the extent that I have chosen to go for auto land, which is I am now switching on all the systems and we're landing purely by autopilot. So please turn off everything that you have because I don't want any interferences. And we were all sitting there thinking, okay, this is kind of cool on the one hand, but kind of weird and on the other.
Silence.
And we came in and the pilot's like, I'm still here, but basically my job is to make sure that nothing goes wrong. But we went in and that was the smoothest, most elegant landing, and the pilot came on and said, that was, for those that haven't gone through it, auto land. Right? So in that case, it was beyond the capabilities of the pilot to safely land, so they either had to abort and go to a different airport, which is a different country, or auto land.
So what I was actually trying to get at, and you set it up for me, is this whole predicate of AI, which is effectively artificial intelligence, as we all know. So the school of thought that I come from is actually it should be augmented intelligence, which I'm sure you've heard of it. But to go beyond the party line, what I actually mean by that, or what people believe in augmented intelligence mean by that. If you look at the whole school of research, development, applications, they design the applications with the objective to replace the human. That's, to me, when it shouldn't be the case. Augmented intelligence is when you design it to augment the human, yet will result in situations where it will replace it. Again, it could be argument of semantics, but it's a fundamentally different starting point. Because when people we always have this discussion about singularity. David, when do you believe that AI is going to take over the world? I kind of look at him saying, well, if you design the bloody thing to take over the world, guess what? It's going to do that.
Okay. So let me, before we go down the rabbit hole of the singularity, you want to talk about the singularity?
Steve, I just want to add that actually, going back to your doctor example, right? That is a classic scenario that we use to illustrate what we are promoting. If you are a company and you're thinking about introducing AI and that's a service, right? First of all, what are you consulting the AI for? Is it a cold? Is it a knee surgery? Is it a gastric flu? Is it diarrhea, right? What's the risk, right? And then depending on the risk, if it's a cold, and I'm only just starting to have the sniffle, forget the doctor. You just go straight to the AI. The AI tells me this is it, I'll go for it, right? But if I've been having diarrhea for 2 weeks, right, and I go to see a doctor and the doctor tells me, it's 2 weeks. I don't think that it's anything normal, but wait, let me consult Siri. For example, you've got Siri for doctors, right? Before I come back to you with my diagnosis and prognosis. Now, that gives me more confidence because the doctor is actually trying to make use of available technology to make his service better, right? So it comes down to risk. What's the decision-making model? Purely AI? Was there a human in the loop? Was the human ultimately making that decision? And even in the auto landing situation, it was an assessment of the pilot who thinks that in this situation, a fully automated one was better. So I think that is the kind of, I would say, discipline that we want to promote when we are designing systems.
Okay, let me crash on because we're going to run out of time. Since we have a couple of regulators and we have a profit-oriented company on the stage, one of the questions is the progression of AI and governance and frameworks the role of government, or is it the role of technology, and I'll take it off technology companies, is it the role of private sector, or is it the role of public sector to try and think about next steps and how to regulate and how to keep safe? So to sort of paraphrase, role of government to protect citizens, or role of self-organizing citizens and companies that say, that's not acceptable to us, that's not going to happen. As in the Google employees that said, hey, we're not very supportive about this military adventure. So private sector or public sector?
Very straightforward. I think it's public sector. And why we say that, a big part of it is that if you think about that, the government officials, whether the politicians, they're all elected by the people. The companies, for-profit companies like ourselves, we are not elected by the people. We are builders of technologies and all that. And a lot of times, the public sector, the regulators, the politicians, they are there, they are elected to protect the interests of the people that they represent. So it's crucial that we think about it in this fashion, because and this is you can judge this by some of the recent actions that we have done. Brad Smith, our chief legal counsel, have recently come out very clearly to say that we are asking governments around the world, regulators around the world, to regulate, for example, facial recognition technology. And the unintended consequences is there. And we as technology giants, we know how the technology works, we know what it's capable of, and we can see the advancements in it. But at the same time, the governments are there to protect the interests of the people itself. So I think that's, it's a pretty kind of black and white answer for us in some sense, that we say, yes, you don't want to hamper the development of the technology in that way, but at the same time, in the areas of regulation, we really want the public sector and the regulators to step in and say, what's the right thing for the people itself?
Actually, I disagree.
You want us to regulate?
No. Actually, I disagree in the sense that it shouldn't be a binary public or private. And the approach that we've taken is that we have to do it together, because the technology is developing. We don't know enough in the public sector. We don't play with the technology as much as the private sector. So that's why when we put together the advisory council, the whole intent was to put the technology providers, the people who were going to use the technology, the consumers, and also companies that intend to use those technology, put them together. What we do is we're just a convener. We provide tea, coffee, and a meeting place, right, for that discussion to happen. And I think that it is important that in this area, we have to work together and co-create. Because otherwise, if it's a public sector, the instinctive reaction is always regulation. And I don't believe that regulation is the right approach to this, right? But we are also very alive to the dangers that if technology companies run ahead too fast, or use and adoption runs ahead too far ahead of what consumers are ready for, there will be pushback. Right? So I think it's something that in this area, particularly in the area of getting the technology into the markets, we have to do it together.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working together. That's
Okay,
for sure.
so David, before you make your comment, I want to give you an easy question, just because part of what we want to do through these is always have time to chat. And some of these I think are interesting. I'm not sure I even understand what some of them represent, so it may be easier to discuss in individual settings, off-stage settings. So I want to make sure that we leave at least a little bit of time for us to get together after the panel. So I'm going to make this the last one. It's going to be an easy one, David, and anybody that wants to jump in, which is ethics. Are ethics something that the government has a position on, or are ethics something that individuals and societies and cultures and families shape? So when we say AI ethics, what's the role of government in any event?
You said easy question. Where's the ethic? Okay. Okay, so when you say government, you're obviously looking from a collective point of view. So actually the answer will be yes. In fact, very much so, because you would believe in most cases that the government is the representation of the people, and therefore of the culture and what they want to achieve from an ethical point of view, from a societal perspective. With that premise, the answer is yes. And to add to it, and also on the point, and I give just a bit closer answer to Zikin, is it's very much a two-dimensional, because ultimately, as government, as more specifically a regulator, enforcer, is to make sure you do the right thing. And to make sure that there are no bad actors, and when there are bad actors, they get punished. But everyone, not just companies, everyone, and I'll just use this catchphrase, which you may have heard before, do no evil. It's just the ethical thing to do.
Assuming we can agree on the definition of what those words mean. But yeah, I understand. That's where the Google employees kind of said, hey, in our view, this goes outside that parameter. So.
Well, actually, it's phrased in the book that what I needed to learn was what I learned in kindergarten. Remember that one? Like, you guys heard of that book, right? Yeah. You know, share everything, you know, clean up your mess after yourself, don't take anything that's not yours. Yeah, don't pick a fight.
Okay, so before we go through, because we want to talk about AI and ethics, so here's what I'm going to summarize is, as you would imagine, tricky, uncertain. What's the role of government? How much? How little? Doesn't mean Singapore government only, any government. Can we harmonize? Yes, it's a good thing. Using data. Clearly, some people are willing to make the trade, which is take my data, give me something in return. We do that with social media. We do that with iTunes. We do that with Amazon. So that's not new ground. Take my data to pursue a different healthcare outcome for me. People are more anxious about sharing health data. So there's different interpretations. What I'd like to try and leave us with is, can we please continue to discuss, because how we use data, for what purpose? Are we supportive of AI when it reaches an equivalent level? That's a big social question. If it's as good as, are we willing to adopt AI? Because it leads inevitably to the issue of what happens to everybody that was doing whatever that role was. Universal basic income, useless class, any of these things that you want to discuss. So all we try to do is encourage the ongoing discussion, the debate. There's not a right answer as much as there's a journey, but I think it's important for us to try and at least be a part of that together. As much as anything, it's a chance for us to get to know people that are in that area of building AI, because we think it is both inevitable and important. We're AI evangelists, and I think my friends would agree that we don't seek to fear it. We seek to understand it and seek to think about transparent and explainable AI and so on. Let's go to the chance to get to know each other face. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, panelists.
Oh,
thank you.
Yes, I do. By the way, you have a very nice little
the suitcase.
Oh, thank you.
Where am I taking the water?
Created for clients.
There you go.
Thank you so much. I'm actually writing a book regarding Industry 4.0 and all these things, so it would be great to catch up.
Please, I'll be very happy.
Mike. Pleasure to meet you. My name is Josh. I'm from the Ministry of Law. Yeah, my understanding